House will come to order. Prayer by the chaplain.
Mr. Speaker and members, I was going to have us pray in communion tomorrow with the World Day of Prayer, which is a network of women from around the world who are united in prayer and solidarity, and then realize today that this is the birthday of the mother of our friend Patrick Murphy. And Helen Duffy Murphy died a year ago this coming month, or this month when we're in. Let's take a quiet moment and thank God for our own mothers, living, deceased, and ask that their prayers for us would redound to the good of the people we serve. For the women who gave us life and bred us into adulthood and gave us the values that teach us public responsibility, we are grateful. God's source of all good things, help us to live in ways that make them proud of us. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Members, our guest chaplain for today is Reverend Kevin McDonough from St. Peter Claver Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. Please remain standing and recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Clerk will take the roll. Clerk will close the roll. A quorum is present. Clerk will read the journal for the preceding day.
Journal of the House, 87th Session 2012, 79th day, St. Paul, Minnesota, Wednesday, February 29th, 2012.
If there are no objections, further reading of the journal will be dispensed with, and the journal will stand as corrected by the Chief Clerk. Hearing no objections, the journal stands as corrected by the Chief Clerk. Reports of standing committees and divisions. Copy of this order of business has been placed on each member's desk. If there are no objections, the reports will be adopted. Hearing no objections, the reports are adopted. Second reading of House files.
Second reading, House File 1738.
Second reading.
Second reading, House File 2333.
Second reading.
Second reading, House File 2373.
Second reading.
Second reading, House File 2441.
Second reading. Second reading of Senate files.
Second reading Senate File 1073.
Second reading. Introduction of bills. The following House files have been offered for introduction today. The Chief Clerk will report these House files and give them their first reading.
Introduction and first reading of House Files 2617 through 2631.
First reading, House File 2617 through 2631. Messages from the Senate.
Message from the Senate, Mr. Speaker, I hereby announce the passage by the Senate of the following Senate file herewith transmitted. Senate File 1599 and Senate File 1656, signed Kellar Ludeman, Secretary of the Senate.
First reading of Senate files.
Introduction and first reading of Senate File 1599, an act relating to Veteran Affairs. The bill is being referred to the Committee on Commerce and Regulatory Reform. Introduction and first reading of Senate File 1656, an act relating to education. The bill is being referred to the Committee on Education Reform.
Calendar for the day. The first bill on the calendar for the day is House File 554. Chief Clerk will report the bill.
House File 554 on the calendar for today, the first engrossment, an act relating to state government.
Calling the author of the bill, a member from Hennepin, Representative Downey, to present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And could I just clarify with the Chief Clerk the bill number?
1 minute, Representative Downey. Members, if you could please take your conversations to the alcove, or better yet, the retiring room, so that the debate on the floor can be heard by those members. Representative Downey, please restate your question for the Chief Clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to confirm that we're dealing with House File 545.
That's it.
That's correct, Representative Downey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just didn't want to describe a bill that we weren't dealing with. Members, House File 545 is a bill that would require the executive branch agencies, when they submit their budget requests to the legislature every biennium, to also include an analysis of what they would do if federal funds were severely disrupted, some kind of a federal insolvency or default event. And I think the timeliness of this bill is kind of increasing by the year. I first introduced it 2 years ago when I got down here in the legislature. We didn't act on it last legislative cycle, and we are this time, and I'm thankful for that. And I just ask members, as we consider this bill, to remember that we have $16 trillion of active debt at the federal government. Somewhere between 60 trillion and 100 trillion of unfunded liabilities, depending on whose calculation you look at. Last summer, we went right up to the brink on the approval of the extension of the debt ceiling, and we have seen, none of us has missed the European debt crisis news that seems to be out there daily. And so this bill requires the executive branch agencies to take a look at their federal funding streams and provide for the legislature a contingency plan for what they would do if those funding streams were severely disrupted in the case of some kind of insolvency. And members, the methodology that's prescribed at a high level in the bill is very much similar to what any private sector organization would do as they look at their own risks and trying to mitigate them. Most businesses, most organizations would take a look at their single largest vendor, their single largest customer, and say, what would happen if we lost them? They would try to identify the risks. They'd identify the likelihood of those risks actually materializing into events, the severity of those events, and they would have mitigation plans and a strategy for how to monitor those on an ongoing basis. So that is what we're asking the executive branch agencies to do. I've met with the Department of Management and Budget. They actually did some of this at the governor's request last summer when the debt ceiling debate was raging in Washington. And so these are not new skills necessarily. They've already done a little bit of this in the past, so we're just asking them to include this in their budget preparation discipline.
Discussion. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Downey, moving to amend House File 545, the First engrossment as follows. The amendment is coded A5.
Call the member from Hennepin, Representative Downey, to present your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Representative Downey, I want to thank you for bringing forward the issue of federal debt. If I recall correctly, we all know that President George W. Bush inherited, I think it was a $5.6 trillion surplus. And when he left office after a couple of wars and some tax cuts, ended with a $10 trillion deficit. So I think bipartisanly we're all concerned about the status of the federal government. I do hope also bipartisanly that we are in favor, as I think we are, transparency and accountability in how Minnesota spends its money, especially when we ask the state government workers to engage in certain activities. There's a cost associated with that. The A5 amendment simply asks that when the executive branch departments engage in the process that Representative Downey has outlined here, that they identify what the cost of that process was for the voters, so that we've got that transparency and accountability that we all want, and they understand the costs associated with the work that the legislature directs. Mr. Speaker, unless Representative Downey takes this as a friendly amendment, which I hope he will, I would ask for a roll call, please.
Representative Downey has requested a roll call. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call on the amendment. The member from Hennepin, Representative Downey, to the bill, or to the amendment, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Downey, I don't know, I'm thinking about this. I don't know that I have a huge problem with this, except that in my discussions with the department, they explained pretty clearly that a lot of this type of analysis is already being conducted in the thousands of hours that are spent in budget preparation. They'll have to work through innumerable scenarios and circumstances, and this would just be one more of them. So I think to call out the discrete costs of this particular piece of the budget preparation would be to isolate something that might be pretty difficult for them to even report on, and I think what might be more relevant to the legislature would be the total cost of the overall budget preparation activity as compared to just one of literally dozens of scenarios. So, members, I'd encourage a red vote on this. Representative Downey, if you wanted to maybe change this and come back and have an amendment that would ask the agencies to report on the total cost of their budget preparation, that would be more relevant. There are just so many different scenarios of which this would just be a part. I don't even know how they'd kind of call this out, and I don't know what value that would be to us. It's such a small fraction of the overall budget preparation. So I'd urge a red vote, members.
Discussion to the Downey amendment. Member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if Representative Downey would yield for amendment. I'm sorry, for a question.
Representative Dabney or Downey? You looked
Downey.
at
Downey.
Representative Downey will yield. Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Downey, what I would like to better understand is the difference between your bill and the analysis that the governor ordered last summer. As I read this Star Tribune story, it says that the governor directed his budget chief to assess how a possible U.S. debt default would affect Minnesota's finances, and that was in the specific context of Congress failing to enact legislation to raise the debt ceiling and or to reduce the level of federal debt to meet the current debt ceiling. And of course, there was a lot of discussion at the time about the president's inherent authority under the 14th Amendment to deal with this kind of issue, which I certainly think he has. So your bill, however, doesn't talk about the debt ceiling or a debt default. It talks about insolvency. And I wonder if you could explain to us the difference between insolvency in your bill and the specific issue of the debt ceiling, and what kind of insolvency you would have in mind that we should be planning for.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Downey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Winkler, you may remember we had this exact question debated in committee. And debt default within the financial world, and I don't pretend to be an expert here on this, but debt default has a very specific kind of technical meaning. And when you default on your debt, all kinds of things are triggered then within the financial markets. People who've got credit default swaps and those kinds of things all of a sudden have events triggered on them. Those who have insured those instruments have things triggered on them. So a debt default would be one specific instance or example of an event that could lead to the federal government being largely insolvent and unable to pay its own bills. You could also envision scenarios where there just was not a market for the U.S. Treasuries. You could envision other cash flow issues. And so I think the term insolvency as a broad umbrella is preferable to a debt default, which would, I think, have a very specific meaning.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, Representative Downey, I think you've just stated very clearly why the Downey Amendment should be adopted. What the governor requested was a response to a specific issue, which at least is theoretically possible, that there would be some sort of failure to raise the debt ceiling and a default could occur. But what you're talking about is much broader, much more theoretical. It's interesting that when the U.S. credit rating was dropped this summer, within weeks or within days, the cost of purchasing U.S. Treasuries was actually lower than inflation. So people were paying the U.S. government to be able to put their money in Treasury bills. And this kind of fear-mongering about deficits and debt right now is, I think that's what this is really about. So the Downey Amendment, I think, is an important way for us to limit the cost, or at least know about the cost involved in doing this kind of theoretical hypothecating about what might happen and looking at indicators for that. I think you're asking for something far broader than what the governor ordered this summer. So I'd really urge us to vote for the Downey Amendment and really not ask agencies to start engaging in fear-based or myth-based analysis of future events. We might just as well ask them to engage in an analysis of what would happen if an asteroid were to strike. We know it's pretty serious, but it's kind of a hypothetical that we might not want to spend a lot of time or money working on.
Discussion to the Downey Amendment. Seeing no further discussion, a roll call being requested. The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. Clerk will close the roll. There being 60 ayes and 71 nays, the amendment is not adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the next amendment.
Winkler moving to amend House File 545, the first engrossment as follows. The amendment is coded A6.
Call the member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler, to present your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Downey, I appreciate you bringing forward this budget analysis bill so we can have a little discussion about the actual budget forecast for the state. Yesterday we had a forecast number that came out that was frankly misleading at the very best. Members, we all know that we owe the school kids of the state $2.4 billion. We know that we borrowed $700 million last summer from tobacco payments. That's not recorded in the budget forecast. So just on that conservative number, we have a $3.1 billion deficit that the $300 million extra bump from this last forecast and the $800 million from the one before doesn't even begin to touch. So members, I would urge us to vote for the A6 amendment, and the purpose of the amendment is simple, honest budgeting. If we owe $3.1 billion, we should say so. This amendment only addresses the school shift because it's harder to put this language in place for the tobacco debt, but at least we should acknowledge our debt to the school kids of the state of Minnesota that we enacted last summer. So for the sake of honest budgeting, a little bit of a reality check for members of the public and for ourselves, we need to adopt the A6 amendment so that future budget forecasts will actually show what we owe and not give an optimistic view. And members, it's a simple little point. The education increase that was supposedly part of the budget deal last summer actually was less money than metro area school districts had to borrow this year just to deal with this issue. So I think we are far, far short of being honest with the public and honest with each other about the numbers in our state budget. And I would urge adoption of the A6 amendment and would ask for a roll call.
Representative Winkler requests a roll call. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call on the Winkler amendment. The member for Dakota, Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, I rise to a point of order under House Rules 4.05. Amendment limits. There is not a budget resolution in effect at this point. This obviously would affect the levels of spending in the K-12 area and throw the adopted budget out of whack.
Representative Holberg has raised a point of order under Section 4.05. Discussion. Advice. Member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen. Advice.
I think that Representative Holberg actually just answered the reason why her point is out of order. There is no budget resolution at this point, so I don't know what could be put out of order. And in fact, this doesn't actually change any additional spending. It just reflects what we actually are spending. It actually reflects reality instead of unreality. And so I think this motion actually makes absolutely no sense, and the Speaker should strike it, should take it not well taken.
Advice. Member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, advice. The amendment only says what the forecast number must assume. It doesn't require the forecast number to start spending money. It just assumes what the number would look like if we actually were to live up to our obligations and pay back the kids the $2.4 billion we've taken from them. So it's just saying what the number should be. It doesn't obligate us to actually do our job and pay those kids back. It just says we should be honest about what the nut is that we have to crack.
Member from Dakota, Representative Holberg. Advice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Well, K-12 funding is a forecasted program. So I don't know if this is a chicken and the egg thing, but because it's a forecasted program, you have the amount of funding in the forecast. All of a sudden, by virtue of amendment on the House floor, you change that whole policy.
Advice. The member from Hennepin, additional advice.
Mr. Speaker, just in response to Representative Holberg's statement, we're not changing the amount of forecast spending. We're saying that when we're forecasting the budget deficit, we should assume that we're going to pay it back. The spending might not actually be locked into place. We might decide to not make the right decision. We might decide not to pay them back. We might have that written in current law. But when we're giving the number to the public, when we're looking at the number that we have to deal with, and we can always pass a law that says we don't have to worry about the forecast number, we don't have to worry about the school shift, and we don't have to worry about the projected spending in K-12. That's fine. We can do that. This doesn't require us to spend the money. The point of order is not well taken because all we're talking about is the forecast number that is announced.
Advice. Seeing no further advice, having heard advice from Representatives Holberg, Representative Thiessen, the Minority Leader, and Representative Winkler, I find the Holberg point of order is well taken. Member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to appeal. It is well taken? Oh, he said is well taken? Is well taken. So I'd like to appeal
You'd like to appeal the ruling of the Speaker? And you requested a roll call?
Well, I think, don't we have to do that? Yeah, I'll request a roll call.
Representative Thiessen appeals the ruling of the Speaker and requests a roll call. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call on the appeal of the ruling of the Speaker. Discussion. Member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, advice to the body.
State your advice.
Members, it shouldn't be so hard for us to tell the truth. We don't have to hide behind a point of order. We don't have to hide behind a rule that doesn't apply. We don't have to hide behind the facts. The facts are we owe kids money, and every time we have a budget forecast that doesn't reflect the money that we owe school districts, we are not telling the truth. Telling the truth shouldn't be that hard, especially when we are going around telling everybody else how they should run their business. We want to tell everybody how they should negotiate contracts with employees, how they should evaluate teachers in local school districts. We're trying to tell people all sorts of things, and yet we can't even bring honesty to the table from the beginning. Members, this is a simple measure to say that we should reflect in our budget what we owe. For the party that believes in fiscal responsibility, I can understand that borrowing money is a hard thing to do, but sometimes you have to be honest with yourself, acknowledge that you did it, and try to find ways of fixing it. But it starts with honesty. And members, that's what this budget amendment is about. That's why the Holberg point of order was not well taken, should not have been well taken. It's why the Speaker's ruling was an error.
The member from Stearns, Representative Gottwald. Advice to the body.
Mr. Speaker, advice to the body. Mr. Speaker and members, as Representative Holberg indicated just a moment ago, K through 12 is a forecasted program. Her motion is particularly in order. I would urge you to support it, but I think I need to respond a little bit, since we're in advice, to some of Representative Winkler's comments. I wonder if, Mr. Speaker, Representative Winkler would yield for a question.
It is a debatable motion. Representative Winkler will yield. Representative Gottwald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members, Representative Winkler, I wonder if you can tell me whether the budget passed honestly, transparently by the Republican majority, by the legislature, at the end of the last regular session, in fact, balanced the budget without an education funding shift and without some of the so-called gimmicks you've referred to.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Gottwald, your budget was held together by duct tape, and I don't remember the specifics of whether you had a school shift roll of tape involved or not. I do remember specifically, though, in your area of the budget, that the Republicans were going to cut 140,000 Minnesotans off of health care. So I guess in that sense there was some honesty, but there was a whole lot of fudging of other numbers, especially in the state government bill. And I know Representative Lanning has other things on his mind today, but that original bill cut from all sorts of agencies and moved money around. And members, there was all sorts of funny money involved. And I'm not sure, Representative Gottwald, that you really want to be honest with the people of Minnesota about the effects of your last budget. And I guess it makes sense that you don't really want to be honest about the effects of the school shift either.
Member from Stearns, Representative Gottwald.
Well, Mr. Speaker and members, this is still under advice, and I'm still advising you to support Representative Holberg's. If you listen to what Representative Winkler and Representative Thiessen and others have said here, they're making up their own facts. And they did it back when we passed our original budget, which, for the record, did not have the education funding shift, did not do gimmicks, honestly balanced the budget by reducing the increase in state spending. It was necessitated by Governor Dayton's insistence on more than necessary increase in state spending. And in order to end a painful shutdown for the state of Minnesota, we allowed the governor to bring forward an education funding shift. So if we want to be really honest and transparent here, Representative Winkler, as I'm sure I have no doubt, I wouldn't impugn your motives as you just did moments ago to me, or to our caucus. But I'm sure that in your genuine interest for transparency, you'd want to be honest about that sort of thing. That in fact, the unusual and extraordinary increase in state spending necessitated the kind of shifts and gimmicks that we hear testified to here on the House floor by you and others on your side of the aisle. So as long as we're being very honest and focusing on transparency, I think the people of Minnesota need to know that. We balanced the budget honestly, straightforwardly, without shifts, without gimmicks. You called it duct tape. I'm not sure what you mean by that. What we didn't do was jack up taxes on job creators. But, Mr. Speaker and members, I hope that helps you with your vote on this particular motion, and I would again encourage you to support the Speaker's ruling.
Advice to the body. The member from Hennepin, Representative Carlson.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to offer advice to the body, and the question of the budget resolution came up, and that was inherent in in the Speaker's ruling. And Mr. Speaker, I think you made an error. even the best of speakers from time to time make a mistake. But if you take a look at the rules, 4.03, I'll just read a part of the rule, but it covers the situation. After the committee adopts the budget resolution, the limits in the resolution are effective during the regular session in the year in which the resolution is adopted, unless a different or amended resolution is adopted. And I happen to serve on the Ways and Means Committee. We did adopt a budget resolution that had an impact last session, but it has no impact on this session relative to the Speaker's ruling. And members, there's a reason that we have these rules, and they're to give us the appropriate guidance when we do have questions on how we should proceed. And most of the speakers that I have served with on both sides of the aisle, and I hope it's true with this speaker, I hope this is just a mistake, have honored our rules. And so I would encourage members to take a good hard look at that rule and vote accordingly and vote to override the ruling of the Speaker.
Discussion. Advice? Advice. Seeing no further advice, the question before the body is, shall the decision of the Speaker stand as a judgment of the House? A yes or green vote supports the ruling of the Speaker, and a no or red vote goes against the ruling of the Speaker. A roll call being requested. The clerk will take the roll on the appeal. The clerk will close the roll. There being 71 ayes and 61 nays, it is the judgment of the House that the decision of the Speaker shall stand. Seeing no other amendments at the desk, the clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File 545.
Third reading. Discussion to the bill. Discussion. The member from Dakota, Representative Bills. Discussion to the bill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, members, and Representative Downey for bringing this forward. And I can see by the article that you handed out that that you and the governor are actually kind of thinking along the same lines. And because we went over the data, and specifically to speak to Minnesota, a $62 billion all-funds budget that is exposed $17.5 billion to the federal government, that would be 28% exposed to federal dollars. And that speaks volumes to why this measure is important. And Representative Downey, who I respect very much and is a good friend, and we sit next to each other, so we share a lot of chocolate and conversations together. But to speak about the $10 trillion at the end of President Bush, and I hope you understand that when I teach economics, it's fair, everybody's fair game. It's very important to teach all schools of economic thought and to literally go into detail, whether it's Republican or Democrat, what these deficits and debt and various measures that we take in a monetary way to alleviate some of our pain in the short run. So the actual debt under President Bush in the last year was actually $8.7 trillion. That was 64% of our overall GDP as a country. Today that is over 100% debt to GDP ratio. You might think, you start looking at some of the other economies around the world who are suffering various debt issues, and we have one big thing over on those economies, and that is that we can print our own currency. And our currency, as I was just giving an interview this about a couple weeks ago on a gold exchange bill that I know some of you really like and I know you'll sign on to because you really value what working class people get paid. Because what I would like to see is a measure move forward where people who get paid for work can actually somehow retain their purchasing power and someday put their kids to school. So if you look at, again, the debt to GDP ratios, the only way, and Representative Winkler, I think, brought up the interest rates that are so low, historically low, and the only way, one of the ways that we hold those interest rates down is to actually expand the monetary base. If you look at something called the St. Louis adjusted monetary base, that was $800 billion in mid-2008. So in mid-2008, the St. Louis adjusted monetary base, you can just Google it up and learn a bunch about it, was $800 billion. Today, that adjusted monetary base is $2.7 trillion. So the adjusted monetary base has increased exponentially as we fight and try to hold interest rates down so that we can keep borrowing. Because the only way that you can keep borrowing is to have your agent, specifically with the Federal Reserve and its balance sheet, you can have your agent keep buying the debt, which is currently on bond issues. The Fed is seen to be purchasing 80 to 83% of the bonds. So it's a very important measure that I see, and I appreciate Representative Downey bringing it forward. And thank you very much.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Bills, I'd just like to correct a couple of concepts that you're kind of laying out there without a lot of reason or support. Your first point was that we went from a 64% debt to GDP number to 100% debt to GDP number. And what you're not really accounting for is the history of that period. When George Bush was elected, the economy was strong, and throughout his term of office, he did everything he could to flood the economy with money in order to keep it strong so he could get reelected. And we were actually paying down the debt. And by the time he left office, that number had ballooned to 64%. So we were in kind of a bad spot by the time he was done. And then, all of a sudden, the entire bottom falls out of the economy. We're in the worst recession in 60 years, and the only answer to that is federal intervention as the spender of last resort. That's pretty mainstream. I know it's maybe not mainstream in your high school classroom, but it's mainstream economics. And to go up to 100% debt to GDP number in the middle of this crisis is not unreasonable, and is far lower than what we had the last time it was very high, which was after World War II, when we consistently worked to bring it down. So just like our borrowing to schools, the federal government eventually is going to have to start paying it down over time, just like we're going to have to do. But we're going to have to be honest about it first. And one of the things you have to be honest about is that events have driven this. Choices also drive this. And for us to run around in circles and pretend like the sky is falling is not very responsible as elected officials. And, you know, you have your gold as legal tender bill. I think last year you had Minnesota gets to have its own currency bill. I think those are not mainstream reactions to a problem. And so, members, the Downey bill is just perpetuating this myth that somehow we're all going to fall apart because the federal government had to borrow money to keep the economy from completely zeroing out, on top of the bad fiscal practices of the Bush years. But that myth isn't true. The myth isn't true. We're spending a bunch of money to feed a myth that perpetuates a very zealous anti-government hysteria that is represented in your party and doesn't do either one of us any good in actually solving real problems.
Discussion to the bill. The member from Dakota, Representative Bills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just have to correct one thing, Representative Winkler. You said spender of last resort, and it's actually lender of last resort. The Fed is the lender of last resort, although I guess you could correlate it into spender of last resort, because that's actually what they create, is more spending and more debt, and the system lives off of it. And, you know, and even the surplus, you're absolutely right, you know, you can take the politics of it, and you can take the political virtue of it, and you can try to write your pieces to run on or whatever, but that's simply what's been happening. It hasn't mattered. You want to throw presidents' names around, you can throw presidents' names around from Carter to Reagan to Bush to Obama. It doesn't matter. Even Representative Downey, there's a great video. It's called, just Google in IOUSA. It's put together by David Walker, who is actually the Comptroller General of the United States, posted by President Clinton, reappointed by President Bush. So it really doesn't matter when you're the nation's top accountant. Money is money. Accounting is accounting. So it's a fairly nonpartisan post. And I think what happens is the political virtue of it is that we need to get reelected. We need to either do the spending or we need to give the benefits here. And instead of focusing on the debt as a problem and potentially the insolvency of a problem of a system, is we'd rather get into the 2-year election cycles. And I just want to, because I've been kind of waiting to say this for a while, as a person who's looked into the eyes of 17 and 18-year-olds in the last 15 years, please stop that. And whether it's here or whether it's in Washington, D.C., or whether it was a Democrat majority or a Republican majority, it doesn't matter anymore. Please stop. So I just want to say to the surpluses that Representative Downey talked about, when you include the amount of money that is being taken and spent that we think is being locked in a vault somewhere for our entitlements that isn't happening, and once again, David Walker, Comptroller General under President Clinton, check it out. He does a great job. He's paired up with Peter G. Peterson now. Go on that website. They're trying to solve they're encouraging young people to get involved in this. And that's so it's not a partisan issue. I'm not taking a shot at your president. I understand you can take shots at mine from our party, but try to educate yourself about some of these things, and I think the way forward could become a little bit more clear for us. Thank you.
Discussion. The member from Hennepin, Representative Downey, to your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, members, for the good debate. I think the discussion we've had here today is a microcosm of a broader debate we've been having for a few years now, and that is how long can the federal government continue to go? You can argue the different scenarios. You can call this fear-mongering. You can talk about asteroids and the sky is falling. The reality is it's a period of uncertainty that I think is unprecedented. The trend lines are unprecedented, and absent a serious change of political will in Washington, I think that continues. So in my mind, looking at it just from a business perspective, this is just a prudent, common sense risk management technique that allows us as an executive branch and a legislature to just understand the facts and know what would happen and what kind of disruptions we might experience if there were a serious problem with the federal funding streams. And in my mind, that's just good business. So I'd urge a green vote on House File 545.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. Clerk will close the roll. There being 74 ayes and 57 nays, the bill is passed as titled. Agreed to. Call the member from St. Louis, Representative Dill. For what purpose do you rise?
Point of personal privilege, Mr. Speaker.
State your point of personal privilege, Representative Dill.
Thank you. Come on up. Right here. Members, before us we have a very, very valuable community group of members here, a family from Cook, Minnesota, lives next door to Senator Bach and is a constituent of both of us. Mr. Hippa Russell is a CPA in our community. His wife Lisa, according to my wife at least, is a very, very valuable volunteer aide in the Cook School and helps all the folks there as a volunteer. But we're here really today to talk about Elsie. Want to raise your hand? I think you can see who Elsie is. Wave. She just won the 6 to 9 art contest to be in the 2012 Minnesota Aviation Calendar that was awarded by MnDOT. And she is under the instruction of Mrs. Reed at the Cook High School, and she has done very well, and we're here today to honor her as well. Her brother Jake is an expert archer, and he went to the national finals last year in his first attempt at archery. So this is a very accomplished family from Cook, Minnesota, and I'm very proud to have them here. They're also really good supporters of Tom Bach and I, so we don't mind that at all. Anyway, and the funny thing is Elsie is going to win. In her process of winning, she won a 30-minute introductory flight. which will probably be done at our local airport, and maybe her dad will do it because at their dock they have a 182 Cessna on floats, and those kids have been flying since they were in diapers. So it's kind of interesting that she won an intro flight, and they go to Canada all the time together. But anyway, we're here to honor Elsie Hippa, and her family. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Representative Dill, and thank you, Elsie. Member from Washington, Representative Detmer, for what purpose do you rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yesterday, Representative McDonald kind of jumped the gun. It was not my birthday yesterday. It's today. But most important, my wife's birthday is today, too. So Colleen is here with me. We have her birthday on the same day. Thank you.
Speaker. The next bill, I'm sorry. Oh, the member from Hennepin, Representative Green, for what purpose do you rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thought that in the spirit of birthdays, we should also acknowledge Rick Hansen's birthday.
And the calendar for the day. The next bill on the calendar for the day, House File 1560. The Chief Clerk will report the bill.
House File 1560, the first engrossment, an act relating to state government.
Call the member from Clay, Representative Lanning. For what purpose do you rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. A point of personal privilege. We're not done with the birthdays. Arlen Restad, our longtime page and friend, also has a birthday today. Let's give tribute to Arlen.
The calendar for the day. Representative Wardlow, House File 1560, the member from Dakota. Please present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, House File 1560 is a bill about administrative law and disputes between administrative agencies under the executive branch and Minnesotans and Minnesota businesses. It's also a bill about the rule of law and the separation of powers. It's a bill about liberty, and it is a bill about the very kind of government we have. It calls into question whether a government, a representative government of liberty and the law, is compatible with an ever-burgeoning, growing administrative state. It asks the question, do we trust the people of Minnesota with self-government? Do we trust their representatives to govern? Or do we trust things to administrative agencies and so-called experts, technocrats? As with the previous discussion on the previous bill, this concerns a trend line. As the federal government grows and as federal bureaucracies grow, so too do state bureaucracies grow and take over more and more authority and touch people's lives and business activities in more and more numerous ways. So how does this bill address those different things? How does this little bill do that? Well, right now we have an untenable situation in Minnesota from the perspective of liberty and from the perspective of our founding principles. We have a situation where administrative agencies are given rulemaking authority. They take that rulemaking authority, they make rules, and then they enforce those rules, they administer those rules as they are supposed to do. They execute them, being in the executive branch. And then they sit and prosecute Minnesotans and Minnesota businesses for violations of the same rules that they themselves made. And they do that in front of administrative law judges, ALJs. So they have policy-making authority, pseudo-legislative authority. They have prosecuting authority. They have executive authority. And to top it off, if an administrative agency head does not like or has reason to call into question a decision of an ALJ, an administrative law judge, in a contested case between the agency prosecuting the case and the regulated party, a Minnesotan or Minnesota business, the agency can change the ALJ's decision, can go in and change the judge's findings of fact and conclusions of law, and the recourse then of the Minnesotan or regulated party is appeal to the Court of Appeals. That's the situation now. All this bill does is take the authority of the agencies to rewrite decisions of administrative law judges away and gives the ALJ's final decision-making authority in all instances. So all contested cases, all disputes between regulated parties on the one hand and state agencies, boards, what have you on the other hand, must go to an independent tribunal of judges, the Office of Administrative Hearings, for decision, and that decision is final under the bill and cannot be rewritten by the same agency that makes the rules, prosecutes the rules, and decides and goes in front of the ALJ. So it puts Minnesotans and agencies on equal footing for purposes of appeal then to the Court of Appeals. That's what the bill does. So if we believe in the separation of powers, if we think that independent tribunals of judges should determine disputes between agencies and regulated parties rather than agencies themselves, then we should vote green on this bill. Thank you.
Discussion. Seeing no amendments at the desk, the clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File 1560.
Third reading. Discussion. The member from Hennepin, Representative Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Representative Wardlow yield to question?
He will yield. Representative Simon.
Representative Wardlow, other than liberty and protecting our founding principles from the attack of a burgeoning, insensitive state that will deaden the senses of our democracy, other than that, what is the problem what is the practical problem that we're trying to solve here?
The member from Dakota, Representative Wardlow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Simon. The practical problem we're trying to solve here is the consolidation of different powers of government into the hands of a single entity. It's a problem of principle. Our founding principles, as you just cited, our founding principles include the separation of powers. If you look up tyranny in Black's Law Dictionary or pretty much any dictionary, you'll find that the definition sometimes or usually includes reference to combining the different functions of government, judicial, administrative, and legislative into a single person or entity. Well, that's what we have here with administrative agencies in Minnesota. Just as we have with the federal government. We have agencies that make law and then execute the law, prosecute in front of ALJs, and then have the power to go back and rewrite decisions so they're sitting in judgment as well. Put all those together, that is contrary to everything that the separation of powers is meant to protect, which is a regime of liberty under the law. You cannot have liberty, you cannot have a rule of law when you have an agency head or an agency under the executive branch, not appointed, not elected, unelected technocrats and bureaucrats, well-meaning no doubt, but you can't have liberty if you give one entity that's unelected all of those powers, judicial, legislative, and executive, and call it a day. So that's the practical problem we're trying to solve here. And it will prevent us from going further down a path that will lead to bad places.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Representative Wardlow, I had some other questions, but I understand this is important philosophically to you, and I have to respect that. But as you know, I'm sure, and as it came up in the various committee hearings, I mean, this is truly a pretty radical step. Every state in the country has something, as you know, called the Administrative Procedures Act. Minnesota's the same. And this would really throw a wrench into it. That doesn't by itself make it a bad thing just because we're changing it, but let's just acknowledge that that's what we're doing. This would be pretty radical, pretty big, and I think if you're going to justify a step like that, certainly if you want it signed into law, I think something beyond the principle that you're enunciating is important here. Members, you know, this looks to me, and I know this isn't your intention, Representative Wardlow, but this is a way to kind of do an end run, kind of a shortstop move around the executive branch. And I understand the impulse around here, and both parties are guilty of the same hypocrisy. I understand when the other parties in power, there tends to be more suspicion about the outcomes from executive branch agencies, and the hypocrisy goes both ways. And then when it's the in party, then there's this sort of impulse to sort of let the administrative branch or let the executive branch do what they're going to do. But I guess the bottom line here is we already have the protection of the Minnesota Court of Appeals. This is appealable right now under the current system. Nothing's final. It can go up through several other layers of review. And I think we have to realize, too, Representative Wardlow, that when you talk about judges, here you're talking about administrative law judges. And they're very able and capable people, but they're not elected by anyone. They're not appointed, at least directly, by the governor. They have civil service status. They don't stand for election. Whereas under the current system, there are those layers of review where it goes up to people who are elected, who all of us in this room and our constituents have a say over. So I think that's an important part of it. And members, if you look at the letter that's been handed out with my signature on the top, it's from the Commissioner of Labor and Industry, Ken Peterson. He's had this job twice, actually. He had this job during the Perpich administration, same commissionership, and now he has it again. So I do appreciate and respect his perspective. And you can read for yourself. I'm not going to try to read the letter to you. But essentially what he's saying is beware, because some of the things that I know, Representative Wardlow, you want to do, you want to make things more efficient and more effective and have sort of a one-stop shop. It could have a boomerang effect here. And the idea is when you entrust everything to these administrative law judges, who are jacks of all trades, they're generalists, they're not specialists, they don't have expertise and knowledge in every subject. When you say that the buck stops only with them and there's no review after that other than a court of appeals, I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think that's the way we want to go around it. So I understand the impulse of others, not necessarily you, but others, to try to go around the executive branch when you might not like who's running it. But I think this is a system that's really been good for us for the past several decades, and I'm not sure you've made the case for changing it. Vote no, members. Thanks.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Wardlow, I was going to ask you what James Madison thought of administrative law judges, but of course they didn't exist in 1789. I was going to ask you whether administrative law judges were important at the signing of the Magna Carta, but I didn't think that would be too productive. But then a representative on your side of the aisle came to me and said, Wardlow had me at liberty. So I think that's, where you are with me, Representative Wardlow. You had me when you said liberty. And all thought just kind of went out the window for me. But luckily I have this letter to remind me of some of the practical consequences of your bill. And the fact is that administrative law judges not only are not accountable in the same way that agency heads are, they also don't have the expertise. So members, the whole concept behind an agency and rules and enforcement is you give people who have expertise in a certain topic the authority to decide issues because they know more about it than a typical administrative law judge. They actually know more about it than we do, as hard as that would be to believe on most days. So they're good at it, and that's why they have final say. An example of this just recently, of this working, was the Minnesota Department of Education for a long time was dealing with an online school that was not, in their minds, meeting their obligations under state standards. The administrative law judge put out a long opinion that essentially said that the Department of Education was wrong and that the online school had done things right. And when that decision came out, the Department of Education went along with it. But again, the final decision is with the policy maker or the policy enforcer in the executive branch. And just the final point, I'm all for separation of powers, but as far as I can tell, the ALJ is in the executive branch. And we're talking about an ALJ's authority versus another executive branch authority. So if we're talking about separation of powers, we're talking about it separating the powers within one of the powers or a sub-department of a department or something. We're not really involving the issues you're talking about at all. So even though you had us all at liberty at the beginning of your speech, I realize, and I think all members should realize, that there are real problems with this bill, and the smart, practical approach is to just vote no.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Wardlow, let's get to this practical matter here. I would agree with the representatives that have spoken before, but I'm going to speak to you about the expense of your bill. It's really expensive, and here's why. The way the ALJ system was set up in the first place was to make narrow decisions, and very few people could appear before the ALJ to make those narrow fact-finding decisions. It's an inexpensive process. But if you have the ALJ making the final determination, then all the agency people with the expertise are going to have to go to that ALJ. They're going to have to be part of that hearing. They're going to have to take time away from their agencies to educate the ALJ about something like hydrology. That takes years to understand. That is a difficult situation, or a difficult topic to understand. But that's what agencies would have to do under your bill. Spend all sorts of time and money, Minnesotans' money, in front of an ALJ because they're going to be the final decision maker. Instead, under the current system, the ALJ makes findings on narrow facts, and the agency that has the broad expertise makes the final decision. This is a system that has worked extremely well and has saved Minnesotans a lot of money, and I hate to see you putting on the table something that is far more expensive. Members should vote no.
Discussion. The member from Ramsey, Representative Mahoney, to the bill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've had a lot of dealings with the Department of Labor and Industry, and I've heard them called many, many, many names. But tyranny has never really come into it. Representative Wardlow, to base this bill on the principle of tyranny might be a little bit over the top. Just telling you. Downey has been many things, but not a tyranny.
Discussion. Member from Dakota, Representative Wardlow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. Hard to know where to start, but I'll try to address the comments in some kind of order. Representative Winkler raised some interesting points. He is correct that ALJs were not in existence at the time of our state's founding or at the time of Magna Carta. And the important point here is that ALJs, administrative law judges, are generalists, and they are independent judges within the executive branch. But they are independent. They are within the Office of Administrative Hearings. So I think Representative Winkler is confusing separation of powers with the separation of the departments of government. You can have different kinds of powers in one department, and they can be functionally separated. So we have a functional wall between the Office of Administrative Hearings in the executive branch and the agencies, other agencies in the executive branch. So this bill promotes the separation of powers by making sure that agency heads who are, make up the bulk of agencies that make up the bulk of the executive branch do not have final decision-making authority to rewrite decisions of independent judges in the Office of Administrative Hearings. In addition, members, we trust generalists all the time. We trust generalist district court judges to decide cases. All of us sitting here are generalists. In democracy, we trust generalists. The right to vote. We don't limit the right to vote to people who have expertise in government or expertise in a particular subject matter area because we trust the people and their general knowledge. And we don't require that all people who make laws be lawyers because we trust generalists. And though we only entrust district court judges that position to people who are learned in the law, who are lawyers, they are generalists within the legal profession. They handle all sorts of cases. So the charge that agencies would have to spend all sorts of extra money and time in front of ALJs under this bill is simply incorrect. First of all, the ALJs, currently, the agency comes in and is prosecuting a case against a regulated party. Under this bill, the agency would have to do what it does now, which is have a witness present his or her expert testimony to the tribunal. So the agency's expertise is not lost. It's just heard by the ALJ, And if the ALJ gets it wrong, the agency is on equal footing with the regulated party when they go to the Court of Appeals. There's not an extra layer between the Court of Appeals and the ALJ hearing where the administrative agency gets a second bite at the apple. And I understand from the letter from the Department of Labor and Industry that, in fact, as it currently stands, sometimes, for certain departments at least, administrative law judges make a decision, and then there is another whole layer where there's a second set of briefs submitted, legal briefs, to the agency head on whether the ALJ got it right, and then, after that, there is a possibility of appeal to the Court of Appeals. So, in fact, the bill would save money by taking away that very burdensome middle layer. So this is a good bill. It reduces costs. The fiscal note on it shows no costs. And what we're doing here is trusting generalists to decide cases and put litigants on equal footing with state agencies on their way up to the Court of Appeals when a state agency is accused of overstepping its bounds. It's a very simple bill, and it does go straight to the separation of powers, and it's not based on the principle of tyranny, but combining multiple functions of government, the powers of government, into one entity is a dangerous thing to do. And that's just a very commonly understood principle, and there's nothing extreme about that. So on principle, this is a very good and practical bill that will reduce costs and improve justice for Minnesotans. So I encourage members to vote green.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. Clerk will close the roll. There being 70 ayes and 62 nays, the bill is passed. Its title is agreed to. Next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 1812. Clerk, report the bill.
House File 1812 on the calendar for today, the first engrossment, an act relating to state government.
Call the member from Hennepin, Representative Stensrud, to present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. House File 1812 is a bill that gives permissive language that allows the Department of Administration to consider outsourcing trash hauling services at our Capitol complex. When I came to the Capitol last year, I was actually surprised to learn that we actually have a trash hauling service that we have put together with the state employees and purchased a garbage truck to take care of our trash hauling needs. And at the state capitol, we basically have very modest waste hauling needs here. So this past summer, the garbage truck actually died and expired. And because of state statute, we were forced to actually come up with another garbage truck alternative, so we're leasing one on a month-to-month basis. So the language really just allows permission to the Department of Administration to consider outsourcing this at some time in the future, and I appreciate your support.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Winkler moving to amendment House File 1812, the first engrossment as follows. The amendment is coded A1.
Call the member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, the A1 amendment is pretty simple. It just requires that state contractors have to tell us, they have to disclose if they're going to be doing state work in Minnesota or outside Minnesota or outside the United States. It's a simple requirement that when we're spending taxpayer dollars, we're not subsidizing companies to take jobs out of the state. It should be pretty common sense. And members, I hope that the author will take it, but in the event he doesn't, I will request a roll call.
Representative Winkler requests a roll call. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call on the amendment. Discussion to the Winkler amendment. The member from Hennepin, Representative Nelson.
I just wanted to point out, Mr. Chair, or Mr. Speaker, that we don't have that amendment out here yet, so.
Members, as is usual on the House floor, we will not take a vote on the amendment until each member has had a chance to observe it. We will take a brief pause until the amendment has been distributed. Call on the member from Cass, Representative House. For what purpose do you rise?
Point of personal privilege, Mr. Speaker.
State your point of personal privilege, Representative House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I was telling Representative Franzen that it was my youngest daughter's birthday today, but I didn't want to get up and say that. And she said, well, it's my birthday too. So as long as I'm up, say happy birthday to Representative Franzen.
And now I believe everyone has the amendment by Representative Winkler. Discussion to the Winkler amendment. The member from Hennepin, Representative Stensrud, to the Winkler amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just in response to the amendment, I'm not certain how the jobs could go outside of Minnesota. The trash actually resides in St. Paul, Minnesota, right around us here. So I would appreciate a no vote on the amendment. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler, to your amendment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure Representative Stensrud didn't mean to say that the trash resides in St. Paul, because I'm sure that some of the members of the St. Paul delegation might be upset by that. But just to be clear, members, the amendment doesn't just apply to trash, it applies to all state contractors. So since we're talking about contracting out state work, the amendment applies to any time we contract out state work. We should find out if Minnesota taxpayers are subsidizing jobs to leave the state or leave the country. That's all the amendment does. It seems like a pretty straightforward vote. Representative Droskowski accepted this amendment in committee, and we took a vote and it passed without a single no. So it seems to me that it isn't very controversial. Certainly, Representative Droskowski and I found common ground. So Representative Stensrud, I'd hope that maybe you would take it. But members, if not, I'd urge a green vote.
It's discussion to the Winkler amendment. Seeing no further discussion, a roll call being requested. The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. Clerk will close the roll. There being 64 ayes and 68 nays, the amendment is not adopted. Seeing no further amendments at the desk, the clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File 1812.
Third reading. Call the member from Itasca, Representative Anzels, to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Representative Stensrud yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Anzels.
Representative, usually when outsourcing ideas are proposed to the body, authors will have an idea of how many state dollars will be saved by outsourcing public jobs to the private sector. Do you have any idea at all what your bill will save the taxpayers?
Member from Hennepin, Representative Stensrud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. I didn't want to micromanage the Department of Administration, and that's why we just gave permissive language. This bill will really allow them to take a look at that and evaluate if the savings are significant enough. Currently, we have two employees in the state that work maybe about 4 hours per day, collecting up to a little over 1 ton of garbage per day. A commercial trash hauler would probably collect in the neighborhood of 10 or 15 tons per day. So it just seems like a very reasonable and prudent idea to give the Department of Administration more tools to get their job done in an efficient manner if they want to consider that in the future.
Member from Itasca, Representative Anzels.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, members, it's fairly clear to this member that Representative Stensrud does not know what, if any, savings will take place as a result of outsourcing these jobs to the private sector. So I urge a no vote.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have 3 complaints about this particular bill. The first one is that this does affect 2 people's jobs where waste hauling is only part of what they do. And do we even know what the rest of what they do is, and should we be considering outsourcing that? So it's incomplete at best. The second thing is they're confidential documents in our trash. And so I think that we as a body would want to have more control over who is dealing with our trash and what they're doing with it. Third, and probably most important, I'm going to quote you, Representative Stensrud. Quote, I didn't want to micromanage the Department of Administration. And here we are talking about 2 trash haulers. Instead of messing with the good employees of the state of Minnesota, instead of nibbling away at their rights and their responsibilities, how about we focus on job creation? How about we focus on putting Minnesotans back to work? How about we focus on reinvesting in our schools? This bill strikes me as a really small, insignificant red herring, and I urge a no vote.
The member from Wabasha, Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members, this is a bill that it looks at a waiver. It waivers. We have in law right now a limitation on our departments throughout state government to make decisions on whether or not they're going to outsource certain functions within their agencies. Decisions they could make to save money, decisions they could make to make us more efficient, decisions they could make to make better delivery of government services. All that Representative Stensrud's bill does is says, you know what? For waste haulers, let's let the department decide. Let's let the department decide. If they can find a better way to deliver those services, one that's cheaper, one that Representative Green employs people from the private sector potentially and creates jobs. Members, I encourage you to support this bill. A great bill, a good start, and we'll have another bill coming forward. I'm confident that we'll even provide for more opportunity in this area. Thank you.
Discussion. Discussion to the bill. Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. Clerk will close the roll. Representative Loeffler votes no. There being 69 ayes and 63 nays, the amendment or the bill is passed. Its title agreed to. Member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen, for what purpose do you rise?
Mr. Speaker, a point of personal privilege.
State your point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to acknowledge a group of folks who are up in the balcony today. The Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, Leadership Minnesota. It's a group of people who are involved all across the state who nominated from their companies to come down here today, but a long period of time going around the state learning more about how the various businesses and sectors of our economy work in Minnesota. And the Speaker and I had a great chance to speak with them earlier today. They're a great group of Minnesota leaders, so I hope we can acknowledge them. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative Thiessen. The next bill on the calendar today is Senate File 134. Clerk, report the bill.
Senate File 134 on the calendar for today an act relating to employment.
Call the member from Scott, Representative Beard, to present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, Senate File 134 was substituted for House File 212 last year in a floor action here. Reheard and sent back under Rule 4.20, I believe it was. But it is a straightforward bill brought to me by the Minnesota Inter-County Association and the League of Minnesota Cities. Members, recognizing today's realities that our institutions of higher learning are not necessarily taking kids who are 17 years old and coming straight out of college, doing 4 years and getting their degree. Often it involves an internship. Instead, we have many people who are going to college later in life, or like one of my kids did, taking a couple years off to earn some money and get some military experience and then coming back and going to school. Or those of us that are laid off and changing careers later in life. Oftentimes, members, they need an internship to complete their education and finish their degree. We have, believe it or not, in Minnesota law in Section 179A.03, actually a statutory prohibition against an intern being more than 22 years old. As you can tell, members, this probably doesn't fit the current reality. The bill simply strikes the 22-year age limit and lets anyone who wants to go back to school, work on an internship, continue their education and better themselves, to be able to do an internship of less than 100 days with any public institution without being subject to PELRA. It expands the exemption from PELRA only by striking the age 22 limit. Mr. Speaker, the bill is that straightforward. There's nothing else to explain about it. I'm happy to stand for questions if you need.
Seeing no amendments at the desk, the clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate File 134.
Third reading. Discussion of the bill. Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. Clerk will close the roll. There being 77 ayes and 55 nays, the bill is passed. The title is agreed to. Next bill on the calendar today is House File 1850. The clerk will report the bill.
House File 1850 on the calendar for today, an act relating to state government.
Call the member from Hennepin, Representative Downey, to present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This House file makes a slight but I think important change to a program that we instituted and the governor signed in the state government finance bill last year. It allows the commissioner to set up an employee gain sharing program so state employees who find significant savings or who are part of very large strategic projects and put in a lot of effort and time on them can be rewarded with one-time bonuses. And in the process of the negotiations last year, the maximum award, which is 10% of the documented savings in year one of whatever initiative or savings idea it was, had another limit on it. It was only $1,000 per individual or $2,500 per group. And this bill simply changes that to a maximum award of $250,000, again, not more than 10% of the documented savings. So the intent here is to provide an upper ceiling on this. It's not some kind of a mandatory amount. It's just this is the ceiling that they can go up to. And I think having that larger reward will really incentivize our folks to find really big ideas and look for big savings as compared to just incremental ones. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Discussion of the bill. Seeing no amendments at the desk, the clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File 1850.
Third reading. Discussion of the bill. The member from Olmsted, Representative Liebling. I apologize. Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It had to happen at least once this session. Would Representative Downey yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Downey, I don't understand what the need is for this. That's what I really like you to explain, because here's how I understand what you're doing, and just correct me if I'm wrong. You're giving public employees a bonus if they save the state money, and you want to give them, they're already on the payroll, and they're earning money to do a job. And I remember this, I think this was carried by Representative Welty some time ago, and I think it's a good idea, but what I understand you to be doing here is increasing this up to possibly $250,000 for somebody who's really working at a job that they're being paid to do. And even though they would be saving some money, obviously, I mean, I kind of think that's their job. That may be part of their job anyway. I hope all of our public employees, we've got a great workforce in this state, and I think that most of them are probably interested in saving us money where they can. And I just wonder, why do we need to go to possibly $250,000 out of our state's treasury to incentivize people to save money for us?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Downey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and Representative Liebling. You might notice that in the bill as it was passed last year, it explicitly excludes employees whose primary job responsibility is to identify cost savings or ways of providing better and more efficient service. So clearly there are a group of people who that is their very job, and in that case you're not actually going to just reward them for doing what they do. However, you can envision certain large initiatives, big things that people might do. I'm thinking even of the SWIFT accounting system project. That's an $85 million project. I guarantee you there's literally dozens, maybe hundreds of state employees who have put in an unbelievable amount of effort over the last 2 years to make that thing a success. And at some point in time, if we have the ability to do some more shared services, that could result in tremendous savings to the state. And so for those dozens or hundreds of employees, to be able to provide them an award and then limit that maximum to $2,500, you're giving them a $50 check. I just think that's not fair recognition, and this just allows the commissioner to go up to $250,000 in circumstances like that.
The member from Nicollet, Representative Morrow.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Downey. I see that in some ways, Representative Downey, it looks like this is an idea not only similar to Representative Welty, but to another Democratic idea from President Obama, who instituted the SAVE Award program in 2009. I would like to note, Representative Liebling, that of course our public workers are doing their jobs. They're always trying to find savings. They're always trying to make things a little more efficient, or a lot more efficient. So we wouldn't want to have a suggestion in this bill that absent some kind of prize, our public employees wouldn't do this. They're doing it every day. And I want to be very clear about that. Representative Downey, I was considering bringing an amendment, and I decided not to do so, so I'm not going to ask you to yield. But I do have a question for you to consider. I wonder whether this should be expanded to citizens as well. Because, Representative Downey, assuming that your constituents are like my constituents, they're coming up with ideas on how the state can save money all the time. So I would ask you to consider, as this moves forward, and I don't know what the fate of this bill is going to be given its potential $250,000 payout, to consider whether it should be expanded to include citizen ideas to go along with those great public worker ideas that we hear every day throughout the state.
The member from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Downey yield?
He will yield. Representative Hansen.
Representative Downey, what is the effective date of the bill?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Downey.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Nelson or Hansen, you know what? I don't know. I'd assume immediately, absent any specific date provision in the bill.
Member from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I was just thinking on the bill that we passed earlier. If those employees that are going to have their jobs outsourced, if they have the opportunity to provide ideas for cost saving and could take part in this, if this bill went into effect before we outsource their jobs. On a more serious point, though, Representative Downey, many places in the private sector and in the universities, there are folks that are saving tens of thousands of dollars by implementing energy efficiency cost savings, by weatherizing the buildings. They're putting in different heating systems, replacing the windows. So I wonder if you would yield for another question.
He will yield. Representative Hansen.
Representative Downey, so if a public employee said, if we could put energy efficient windows in this building and that would result in a cost savings, would they be eligible for this payout?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Downey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Hansen, yes, I just would point out two things. Number one, again, if the employee's job is, if they, in that case, were hired as an energy efficiency specialist designed to find those kinds of savings, then I think you would infer from the bill that that is not the type of person who would fit this. And again, would just point out to members that this is something that the Commissioner may authorize. And so I think we're relying on the good judgment of the Commissioner and the management staff to identify where, in fact, some kind of a bonus like this is an appropriate reward for employees.
The member from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
And Mr. Speaker, looking at the Commissioner may authorize and shall establish, but where's the validation of cost savings? Is there a third-party validator to see when the cost savings occurred, or if the cost savings occur initially and then increase later, or how does that work?
The member from Hennepin will yield. Representative Downey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Hansen, the language of the bill says that the Commissioner shall establish a program. So yes, it is incumbent upon the Commissioner to build this program and then at their discretion to implement it in those one-off cases where it makes sense. The specific questions that you asked for are in line 1.13, where it says that the Commissioner has to have documented cost savings to the state, and in fact the maximum award is 10% of the first fiscal year in which the savings are realized. So if this is something that has a ramp-up period in the out years, that first year of realized savings would be the number off of which the maximum award could be determined.
The member from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
And Mr. Speaker, Representative Downey, so would the person that has the idea, would they have to demonstrate the cost savings, or would the Commissioner have to document the cost savings, or would we have to hire additional people to document the cost savings to validate the payment?
Representative Downey will yield. The member from Hennepin, Representative Downey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Hansen, the bill stipulates that it's the Commissioner needs to document the savings.
Okay. Thank you.
Member from Dakota. The member from Scott, Representative Biskins.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I'm going to echo what's been said here before, particularly from the member from Olmsted, but elaborate on it just a little bit, because the member from Olmsted rightly said that this bonus to these state workers is coming out of the public treasury. It most certainly is coming out of the public treasury. But members, how does the public treasury get filled up in the first place? That comes out of taxpayers' pockets. Right? So what we're doing here is we are saying to the state workers that the only way we can expect you to behave the way you should by seeking cost savings in all you do is if we give you money out of taxpayer pockets. I think the principle is all wrong here. Folks, many members on this floor are educators. Right? We understand the value of both intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. We understand that when a young learner, an immature learner, is looking to be rewarded for good behavior, we give them a gold star, or we give them a lollipop. We give them what's called an extrinsic reward. But as a learner becomes more mature, we hope and pray that we move from the extrinsic to the intrinsic, that the learning itself becomes motivation. Well, it looks like we don't have that philosophy in state government. We don't have the philosophy of saving taxpayer dollars at every possible turn, and the only way we're going to get that philosophy is if we give them a gold star and a lollipop to the tune of up to $250,000 per project. The motivation here is all wrong. I think I voted against this legislation when it was first presented and went into the statute books. I'll be darned if I'm going to vote in favor of enhancing it. Please vote no.
Discussion to the bill. The clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There being 91 ayes and 39 nays, House File number 1850 is passed and its title agreed to. The next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 1903. The clerk will report the bill.
House File 1903 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to veterans.
The gentleman from Meeker, Representative Urdahl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This bill concerns honor guard burial details not receiving timely stipends of $50 for burials. Payments are delayed, they are partial or possibly denied because a post or club has charitable gambling. I believe this is wrong. The stipend honors veterans who have served their country and in some cases died for their country, and payments should be made promptly. We should show proper support and respect for these heroes and not punish those providing charities with funding while charitable gambling in many of our rural areas and across the state declines. So we should not tie burials of our veterans to gambling, and we should make sure that they receive the money that the state does send to Veterans Affairs for these burials in a timely manner.
The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File 1903.
Third reading. Any discussion to the bill? The clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 128 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. The next bill on the calendar for the day is Senate File 1213. The clerk will report the bill.
Senate File 1213 on the calendar for today, unofficially engrossed and reprinted for the House to include committee amendments. An act relating to education.
The gentleman from Goodhue, Representative Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Senate File 1213 is modifications to the tracking system for the adult basic education. And we actually had this, we passed this through committee last session, but something happened to the omnibus bill. I think it was vetoed. So we took that out and we passed this along. It actually just helps us track and evaluate the programs for adult basic education to see how they're operating. What it does, it also complies with federal regulations, and actually we've been able to get 3 federal grants over the last 3 years for this. So this is a modification. It actually also includes data in that. But one reminder there is that it is definitely voluntary. It's not a mandate. And I would stand for questions, Mr. Speaker, and appreciate support.
The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate File 1213.
Third reading. Any further discussion to the bill? The clerk will take the roll on the bill. Clerk will close the roll. There being 128 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. The gentleman from Washington, Leader Dean.
Mr. Speaker, I move the calendar of the day be continued.
Leader Dean moves that the calendar for the day be continued. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Motions and resolutions. There are copies of the non-controversial motions at the House desk and online. If there is no objection, we will take the action on these motions first. Hearing no objection, the motions prevail. Announcements.
Oh, we got one more motion.
Oh, excuse me. Excuse me, members. Motions and resolutions.
Beard moves that House File 2169 be recalled from the Committee on Environment, Energy, Natural Resources, Policy, and Finance and re-referred to the Committee on State Government Finance.
The gentleman from Scott.
Mr. Speaker and members, House File 2169 received a very good hearing this morning in the Committee on State Government Finance. It was passed out of there, re-referred to Energy Environment, but we want to take it back there. There's a little more work to do, and we'd rather do it in State Government Finance instead of Energy Environment. Thank you for concurring.
Discussion of the motion. All in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Announcements. The gentleman from Anoka, Representative Hackbarth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I'd just like to make an announcement that I would like you to join me and Representative Lesh tomorrow morning as we welcome Rear Admiral Neil Morsetti from the United Kingdom Royal Navy. Admiral Morsetti is traveling here on official appointment from Her Majesty's government to meet with community and business leaders to discuss how Minnesota can contribute to our national and global energy security and grow jobs at the same time. We will be holding an informal reception for the Admiral tomorrow morning from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. in room 107 of the Capitol. Please join us and stop by at any time.
Thank you, Representative Hackbarth. Representative Gottwald.
Mr. Speaker, point of personal privilege.
Please state your point of personal privilege.
Mr. Speaker and members, we recognized a number of people for birthdays today. I thought we would be remiss if we didn't get up and applaud Sandra Erickson on her birthday today.
Announcements. Leader Dean.
Mr. Speaker, I move that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 3 p.m. Monday, March 5th, 2012.
Representative Dean moves that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 3 p.m. Monday, March 5th, 2012. All of those in favor say aye. Opposed? The motion prevails. Leader Dean.
I move the House do now adjourn.
Representative Dean moves that the House do now adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The motion prevails and the House stands adjourned until 3 p.m. Monday, March 5th, 2012.